Inflation isn't a single number, it's a system. And right now, the mistake many people make is watching the headline rate and ignoring what drives the next move. If you want to understand where inflation goes next, you don't need 20 indicators. You need 3. The first signal is energy. Not because energy is the entire inflation story, but because energy is the fastest transmission channel into the real economy. Oil and fuel prices hit transportation costs immediately. Shipping costs adjust quickly. And energy prices shape inflation expectations because they're visible. Consumers notice fuel prices more than most categories. So, even if underlying inflation is cooling, a sustained rise in energy can keep inflation psychology elevated. That matters, because inflation expectations influence wage demands, pricing behavior, and central bank caution. Energy shocks don't need to last forever to do damage. They just need to last long enough to reset expectations. The second signal is services inflation. Services inflation matters because it reflects the part of the economy that doesn't adjust quickly. You can fix supply chains in months, you can normalize goods inventories, but services pricing is tied to labor, contracts, and habits. Rents reset slowly. Insurance reprices slowly. Healthcare and education costs move on long cycles. And many services businesses raise prices gradually and rarely cut them. That means once services inflation is elevated, it tends to persist. This is also why central banks focus on it. If goods inflation falls but services stays high, headline inflation can look better while the underlying system remains tight. And when the system remains tight, policy stays restrictive. This is how markets get surprised. They price in rate cuts based on a few better inflation prints, while the sticky components never really cool. So services inflation is the truth signal. It tells you whether inflation is actually fading or simply shifting categories. This is the sticky part of inflation. Goods prices can fall when supply chains normalize. But services prices depend heavily on labor costs, healthcare, hospitality, education, insurance, professional services. These categories don't respond quickly to cheaper commodities. They respond to wage growth and demand. So when services inflation stays elevated, it usually signals that the labor market is still tight enough to sustain pricing power. This is why central banks care so much about services. It tells them whether inflation is truly cooling at the structural level, or just falling temporarily because goods prices normalized. If services inflation remains hot, rate cuts get harder. If services inflation cools consistently, policy becomes more flexible. The third signal is wages and labor momentum. Wages matter because they create second-round inflation. When pay rises, spending power rises. That can keep demand stronger than expected, even when rates are high. But wages also raise the cost base for services-heavy businesses. If labor is the biggest input, higher wages usually push prices up over time. The key is direction. If wage growth is slowing steadily, inflation pressure fades. If wage growth reaccelerates, inflation often returns later, even if current prints look better. That's why wages are a forward signal, not just a monthly number. Not because wages are bad, but because wages are persistent. When wage growth is strong, it increases purchasing power. That can keep demand resilient. But it also increases the cost base for companies, which can get passed into prices, especially in services-heavy economies. Here's the critical point. Inflation doesn't fall sustainably until wage growth and demand growth normalize together. If wages keep accelerating, inflation pressure returns. If wages cool too fast, growth risks rise. So the labor signal isn't just about inflation. It's also about recession risk. That's why it's one of the most important macro indicators. Now bring these 3 signals together. Energy tells you whether inflation could reaccelerate quickly. Services tells you whether inflation is structurally sticky. Wages tell you whether demand pressure remains. When all 3 trend down, inflation falls with confidence. When one of them spikes, the disinflation story becomes fragile. So how do you use this practically? If energy rises while services and wages remain elevated, inflation risk increases sharply. If energy rises but services and wages are cooling, inflation may remain contained. If energy is stable but services stays high, central banks stay cautious. And if wages reaccelerate, it often signals inflation pressure could return later, even if current prints look better. The key is not reacting to one report. It's tracking the direction of the drivers. Inflation is a process, not a headline. And right now, the smartest inflation watch is simple: energy, services, wages. Those three signals will usually tell you what the next inflation chapter looks like before the headlines catch up.